Smile secrets. First cracks. Camilla's smile had always fascinated me. It was the kind of expression that could light up a room at a charity gala or disarm a stern ambassador across a banquet table. To the public, it seemed genuine, gentle, unassuming, even grandmotherly. Yet to me, that smile often felt like a mask, polished through years of scrutiny, scandal, and survival. And when I stood before the doors of her private garage, watching them creak open to reveal what lay inside the cracks in that mask became impossible to ignore. The garage had always been off-limits, an unspoken boundary even within the labyrinth of palace properties. Staff whispered about it, occasionally joking in hushed tones that it was Camilla's sanctuary, a place no aide dared disturb. I never thought much of it until that day when circumstances forced it open. What greeted me was not the expected clutter of old vehicles or dusty boxes, but a sight that felt both shocking and symbolic: objects that should have been preserved in the careful archives of royal memory, hidden away in a place that felt secretive rather than protective. Among them were items linked unmistakably to Diana. Personal effects garments, even papers that had long been assumed safely stored elsewhere. The shock among the staff who accompanied me was immediate. Their faces paled, their eyes widened. It was not simply what was there, but the fact that it had been concealed, tucked away from the scrutiny of archivists and curators. In that dimly lit garage, surrounded by concrete walls and the faint smell of oil, I felt as though I had stumbled into the physical manifestation of Camilla's unspoken battle with history. Her smile, once a symbol of reassurance, now echoed in my memory as a strategy. For decades, the press had charted her slow rehabilitation from the vilified other woman to queen consort. The BBC chronicled how she leaned into safe causes, how she carefully chose moments to appear at Charles's side, how she weathered hostility with patience. Reuters highlighted polls showing her gradual acceptance, particularly among older Britons. And yet, here was evidence that behind the public warmth lay private decisions that spoke of control, perhaps even insecurity. I could not dismiss the possibility that what I saw was less malice than self-preservation. Camilla had lived through years of relentless attacks from tabloids. Perhaps hoarding these items, hiding them, was her way of managing a narrative she could never fully escape. But intention did not erase impact. To William and Harry, these belongings were fragments of their mother's sacred pieces of memory. To discover them locked away in Camilla's private space was to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. The staff were horrified, but also bound by the silence that palace life demands. They looked to me as though waiting for someone to put words to the unease none of them dared articulate. I could only stand there, my heart heavy, realizing that the smile Camilla wore in public had always concealed more than it revealed. The garage, with its dim light and secret contents, was the first crack in that mask. In that moment, I saw her differently, not just as a figure who had survived scandal, but as someone still at war with a ghost she could neither banish nor embrace. The smile that had carried her this far was faltering, and what lay behind it was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Soft power access lines crossed. The garage discovery was not just a shock, it was a revelation of how far soft power could stretch when left unchecked. Camilla's influence had always been subtle, never about issuing direct orders, but about guiding conversations, planting suggestions, and leaning on her unique proximity to the king. Access was her currency. She knew when to step forward and when to retreat, when to let Charles believe an idea was his own, and when to press gently until he accepted her view. That kind of influence is hard to detect from the outside, but inside the palace, it shapes outcomes in ways that matter more than the public ever sees. At first, this influence seemed harmless. Camilla took on causes that did not compete with the high-profile campaigns of William and Catherine. She quietly smoothed over awkward moments at state dinners. She provided Charles with reassurance when headlines turned against him. The press often framed this as loyalty, even selflessness. But the garage incident showed me what happens when soft power crosses into dangerous territory, when access shifts from counsel to control, from reassurance to concealment. The question that haunted me was why? Why keep such items hidden away from the meticulous care of archivists whose duty is to preserve royal history? Some advisors whispered theories of practicality that she wanted to keep sensitive materials away from curious eyes. Others, more cynical, suspected it was about narrative, about ensuring that Diana's memory did not overshadow her role. Whatever the motive, the act itself crossed a line. In monarchy, perception is reality, and the perception here was of concealment, of rewriting history from behind closed doors. Mainstream reporting added weight to these suspicions. The Guardian had previously examined the risks of unaccountable influence within the monarchy, arguing that unelected figures with access to the sovereign can steer outcomes with little transparency. Deutsche Welle, covering the debates about slimming down the monarchy, noted that internal consolidation often sparks resentment when it appears to exclude or diminish younger royals. Reading those analyses after seeing the garage contents, I understood more clearly how Camilla's influence was not only personal, but institutional, shaping what the family preserved and what it quietly put away. Polling reflected the fragility of her acceptance. YouGov data showed that while Camilla's popularity had risen slowly, especially among older Britons, younger generations remained unconvinced. For many, Diana was not just a past figure, but an enduring moral compass. To those audiences, Camilla's smile still carried the echo of betrayal, and every hint of overreach reignited that perception. The garage, if ever made public, would not be seen as storage. It would be seen as theft of memory, of trust, of legacy. I also thought of historical parallels. When Queen Victoria died, disputes over her private journals erupted after her daughter Beatrice heavily edited them, cutting passages she deemed unfit for public memory. Historians have criticized those edits ever since, arguing that they erased vital truth. What Camilla seemed to be doing in her own way echoed that precedent, shaping what remained, editing what future generations could see. But the difference was stark. Victoria's daughter acted as family. Camilla acted as stepmother, a role forever sensitive in the shadow of Diana. Soft power is supposed to be invisible, operating quietly in the background. But once exposed, it becomes dangerous. The garage showed me that Camilla's access had tipped into something more tangible, something that could no longer be dismissed as loyalty or practicality. It was influence used to redraw boundaries, to hide what should have been preserved. And in doing so, she crossed a line that turned whispers into suspicions, and suspicions into a reckoning. Diana's shadow motives, self-preservation. Every revelation about Camilla seems to bend back toward Diana, as though the late princess still holds a mirror up to the present. The garage was no exception. To find Diana's belongings hidden away, there was to feel her presence like a cold wind through the room, reminding us all that Camilla's story could never be separated from hers. No matter how carefully Camilla smiled, how gently she spoke, or how patiently she rebuilt her public role, Diana's memory hovered like an unyielding shadow. I could not ignore the possibility that what I saw in that garage was less about spite and more about fear. For decades, Camilla endured relentless public scorn. She had been branded the outsider, the villain in a love story gone wrong. Every headline, every booing crowd outside a church service had reinforced that exile. Perhaps hiding Diana's belongings was in her mind a way of protecting herself from being forever measured against an icon she could never surpass. But if it was self-preservation, it was self-preservation at the expense of trust, and that distinction mattered. Public perception only sharpened the contrast. The BBC frequently revisited Diana's humanitarian legacy, reminding the world of her boldness in embracing AIDS patients and her courage in walking minefields in Angola. Reuters described her as the monarchy's most powerful emotional asset, even decades after her death. In contrast, coverage of Camilla always seemed careful, measured, almost defensive. She was respected perhaps, but never adored. And the garage, if revealed, would reinforce the narrative that she was still fighting a ghost she could not defeat. William's pain brought this into sharper relief. His mother's belongings were not just fabric and paper. They were tangible fragments of memory, sacred in their ordinariness. To see them hidden away rather than preserved with dignity reopened wounds that had never healed. For him, Diana's absence was not history, but daily life. Catherine, too, bore the weight of that legacy, wearing Diana's sapphire ring as both a symbol of continuity and a quiet promise to honor the woman who came before her. Against that backdrop, Camilla's motives, however, explained, looked like betrayal. But I also tried to examine her choices with nuance. History shows us that royal stepmothers often occupy fraught positions, caught between loyalty to the crown and suspicion from heirs. Queen Mary of Modena, centuries earlier, had been accused of scheming against her husband's Protestant heirs, a charge that lingered even without definitive proof. In Camilla's case, every action was read through the lens of Diana's legacy, making even her most pragmatic decisions look like maneuvers. Could she ever have acted without suspicion? Or was the shadow so total that self-preservation inevitably looked like ambition? Still, excuses cannot erase consequences. To conceal Diana's belongings was to tamper with legacy, to risk the very stability the monarchy depends upon. Trust within the family was fractured. Staff who once accepted Camilla's authority now looked at her with wary eyes. Even her smile, once a balm, began to unsettle. It reminded me of a truth often repeated in royal commentary: monarchy is theater, and every gesture is symbolism. By hiding those items, Camilla had performed an act that symbolized erasure, and no strategy could soften how it would be read. International reaction would have been merciless had the story broken then. Al Jazeera would have cast it as proof of monarchy's irrelevance in a modern, transparent age. Deutsche Welle would have highlighted how unresolved legacies of Diana still destabilized the crown. Polling from YouGov already showed that William and Catherine commanded higher trust across demographics, while Camilla's ratings lagged behind, particularly among younger people who viewed Diana as an untouchable icon. The garage revelation would have widened that gap into a chasm. In the end, Diana's shadow is not just about memory, it is about judgment. It tests every choice Camilla makes, refracts every motive, and exposes every act of self-preservation as potential betrayal. And as I stood in that garage breathing air heavy with dust and unease, I realized that Camilla had not only hidden objects. She had revealed unintentionally the truth of her battle, a fight not against people but against a ghost she could never hope to defeat. Network narrative. Pushback. In the weeks following the garage revelation, I began to observe more closely the network that had long shielded Camilla. For years, her advisors had been adept at narrative management. They knew which reporters would write a sympathetic column, which photographers would catch her smiling with school children, which broadcasters would focus on her charity patronages rather than her controversies. It was a finely tuned system, a web of relationships built not on affection but on mutual benefit. And for a time it worked. But after the garage was opened, the narrative began to slip beyond their control. Friendly journalists still wrote pieces portraying her as misunderstood, but they could not drown out the whispers of what had been found. Staff inside the palace, usually discreet, carried their unease into quiet conversations with trusted contacts. The story began to circulate in fragments never fully published, but present in the undercurrent of reporting. Reuters noted renewed questions about Camilla's influence, while The Guardian pointed to gaps in transparency within the handling of personal royal effects. The narrative, once tightly managed, was now fraying at the edges. Her advisors responded with familiar tactics. They pushed photographs of Camilla at animal shelters, laughing with children, speaking warmly at literacy events. They emphasized her role as Charles's steadying partner, highlighting how she kept him balanced during high-pressure moments. These images were meant to remind the public of her humanity, to soften suspicion. And to some extent, they succeeded with older demographics. Polling from YouGov still showed her acceptance holding among those who had watched her transformation over decades. But younger audiences were not persuaded. For them, Diana remained the moral center, and Camilla's attempts at narrative management rang hollow. Social media amplified this divide. Clips of Diana embracing AIDS patients resurfaced, alongside speculation about the garage, creating a contrast no PR team could overcome. Al Jazeera framed it bluntly, suggesting the monarchy was once again at war with its past, while Deutsche Welle emphasized the generational chasm in public sentiment. Inside the palace, the pushback grew sharper. Courtiers who once defended Camilla began quietly stepping back, their loyalty shifting toward William and Catherine, whose popularity felt unassailable. Even Charles's most trusted aides expressed unease, warning him privately that her influence risked damaging his reign. The subtle choreography of palace life, where greeting seating arrangements and small gestures signify status, shifted against her. Where she once stood at the center of influence, she now felt the slow creep of isolation. What struck me most was how Camilla responded. She did not collapse under pressure. She doubled down. Her smile grew even more practiced, her composure even more deliberate. In private, I saw flashes of defiance in her eyes, as if daring her critics to strip away what she had fought so hard to claim. It reminded me of something the Times once wrote: Camilla endures not by conquering, but by outlasting. And yet endurance was no longer enough. The garage had shifted the calculus. The red line had been crossed. Influence that once felt like partnership now looked like overreach. Narrative management that once soothed now felt manipulative. Her network, once a fortress, was cracking under pressure. Even those still loyal to her began to admit quietly that she could not escape the shadow of what had been uncovered. The truth was simple. A smile could shield her from rumor, but not from evidence. In the end, the pushback was not explosive but relentless, a steady erosion of trust and narrative control. Camilla remained outwardly untouchable, her crown intact, her role beside Charles preserved. But the network that once lifted her had begun to fracture, leaving her isolated even as she stood in plain view. And for me, the garage was no longer just a room full of secrets. It was the symbol of a turning point, the moment her narrative slipped out of her hands and trust began to tilt irreversibly away. Reckoning, accountability. What endures? The reckoning, when it came, was not marked by scandalous headlines or public trials. It unfolded in private behind the heavy doors of the king's study, where the air itself seemed burdened with centuries of history. William spoke with the quiet authority of a son, protecting his mother's legacy, placing before Charles not rumors but facts, the belongings discovered in the garage, the whispers from staff, the undeniable symbolism of concealment. Charles listened, torn between his loyalty to Camilla and his duty as sovereign, the conflict etched in every line of his face. Camilla defended herself with the same calm she had perfected over decades. She insisted the items were kept for safekeeping, that archivists had failed to protect them, that her intention had never been erasure. Her voice was steady, her smile carefully deployed even in the tension of the moment. But I had learned by then that charm could not eclipse truth. William's eyes, dark with grief and fury, did not waver. He reminded them both that Diana's legacy was not negotiable, that her children and grandchildren carried her memory forward, and that to hide those belongings was to betray more than just protocol. It was to betray trust. The king's decision came slowly with visible pain. Camilla would remain queen consort. Her crown was untouchable by precedent and law, but her influence would be reined in. She was quietly removed from oversight of archives and estate matters. Her advisors were reshuffled, her access to sensitive decisions reduced. It was not exile, but it was a clear message: the monarchy could endure scandal, but it could not endure betrayal from within. For Camilla, it was a symbolic stripping of power, a narrowing of her once subtle reach. The media framed the outcome in guarded terms. The BBC called it a recalibration of roles within the palace, but readers understood what lay beneath. Reuters emphasized how Diana's shadow continued to shape the monarchy's choices. Al Jazeera highlighted the fragility of royal trust, while Deutsche Welle framed the development as part of the crown's broader struggle to maintain relevance across generations. Public response was just as telling. Sympathy for Camilla was scarce. For many, she had crossed a line no amount of charm could mend. Yet, despite her diminished role, Camilla endured. That is perhaps her defining characteristic: endurance. She still appeared at ceremonies, her posture impeccable, her smile polished. She still walked beside Charles, fulfilling the duties expected of her. But the warmth was gone. Staff greeted her politely, but without affection. Courtiers consulted her less. Even in public, applause felt thinner, more restrained. She had her crown, but not her credibility. I often reflected on what legacy she would leave behind. History rarely remembers endurance alone. It remembers the choices that defined it. For Camilla, those choices were now bound to the garage, to the belongings that should have been preserved with reverence, but were instead hidden away. Her name would always be spoken in contrast to Diana's, her smile forever weighed against suspicion. She had reached the summit of power, but the shadow of mistrust ensured it would never feel secure. And yet, even in this reckoning, lessons endure. The monarchy, for all its secrecy, reaffirmed that boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. William's insistence on accountability showed that the next generation would not allow the past to be rewritten in silence. Diana's legacy, preserved not just in jewels or letters, but in the fierce protection of her children, proved stronger than fire, stronger than concealment, stronger than ambition. As I close this account, I think often of the garage itself, dimly lit, heavy with dust, filled with secrets that should never have been hidden. It stands as a symbol of the battle between narrative and truth, between self-preservation and accountability. Camilla's reckoning came not because of what was said about her, but because of what was found undeniable and unerasable. What endures then is not her influence, but the memory she could never defeat. Diana's shadow remains stretching across generations, unyielding. And in that shadow, the monarchy finds both its most painful wound and its deepest strength.